Hey everyone, we are live and we have some amazing guests and a co-host with us this evening. So Diosselyn Tot, thank you for co-hosting with me today for our Art, Culture, and LAF Festival. Diosselyn is also our marketing chair. So thank you for doing this with us.
Thank you for inviting. I'm excited to learn a lot today.
Me too. So without further ado, Sergio, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, anytime. My pleasure.
So let's get into it. We have you here today because we were talking about asking people about, the roots in Kansas City, Kansas, Kansas City, Missouri. And, that's a part of history that I don't know have a lot of information about and would love to learn more. And I was excited that you reached out and said, hey, let me help. I want to be a part of this.
Yeah, no, I've always been a fan of history in general. And Kansas City has one of the more unique migrant histories for Mexican Americans, for Latinos in general, but mostly it's very Mexican heavy on the community and how it got that way. And there's been a few reasons why it's grown as it has over the past 100 and some odd years, 150 years probably.
Yeah. Can you give us a little bit of background?
In my head.
I know, right? Can you give us a little bit of background about you and who you are and what you're doing right now?
Sure. My background's pretty extensive, I guess, or I guess complicated. I'm first generation American. I was born in California, but I was raised in Kansas City. Came there when I was 2. Both my parents were from Mexico. I have dual citizenship with both countries. I'm currently living in Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. I started in Kansas City working in politics. So it was like a caucus chair for the minority affairs for the Young Democrats of America, participated in the 2000 DNC convention when Gore was nominated. From there, I got into filmmaking, did a few premieres at Cannes during the festival. And back in KC, I was involved with opening a handful of bars. So the long and short, and I have little businesses here and there. So, but my passion is history. And for years, I wanted to do a documentary about this. So I had all these notes when I saw your post about it. I was like, well, I have all these notes about it. So I figured myself.
So with the information that you have in the documentary, okay, so you were in Cannes, like you have a Cannes film, like what in the heck? That's amazing. So what was that about?
Well, there's three that premiered at the festival during the March to Film. So the first one was called Runaways. No one real notable, but it was a great film about runaway youth and kind of exploring the angles on why they run away. So I had like the kid from Last Action Hero with Arnold Schwarzenegger and Hector from the original Friday and Carmine Cardini from the Godfather films. But it was so that went to Cannes. I was 22 when that film went, so that would have been a while ago. And then went back in 2007 with Exploring Love, and then most recently, I think in 13 or 14 with Sanction to Die, Bloodsport. I think that one's on Prime right now.
Yeah,
if anyone wants to watch it.
Absolutely. I know. I think I've heard about that one. I'll have to check it out.
Yeah, Blood Games. Not Bloodsport's a different movie. Blood Games. You're no known film names. Now they had one name, and then when they get sold to a distributor, they change what they want out of it, changing the name.
Absolutely. So has film been something that you've been interested your whole career, like your whole time growing up? How did that all start?
Yeah, when I was I come from a big family. I was the youngest of 5 in my family, but my mom's one out of 21 kids. My dad's like one out of 14 or 16, and so you were always kind of raised by your siblings. And my brother was a manager at AMC in Kansas City, and when my mom didn't have a babysitter, she would send me to go with him for the day. And so I would spend my hours and hours and hours just sitting at the movie theater, and I was fascinated by it, and just how stories are told, and kind of just the longevity that you can have with making a movie. Same thing with music or any type of art, just something that can live past you that people can appreciate or enjoy, hopefully.
Absolutely.
And I had a good chance. It was just a chance to me how I got into film. It was just kind of serendipitous how it all worked out, and ended up becoming a producer. And now working on writing and directing and stuff.
So
My Mexican candy. Sorry.
So Diosselyn's in the arts. Do you have any questions for him, Diosselyn?
Yeah. Well, I have a lot of questions. So
yeah, this is good.
One of the first things is like, I know that you mentioned some of your topics. What inspired those topics? What are those topics about? Why did you decide to go in that route? Let's start there.
The topics on the film front, or what, on what?
Yes, on the films and then on the films and on the work that you have done overall in your career.
A lot of times I'm kind of a mercenary as a filmmaker. You know, I have a director or a writer I work with, and then I see something in the project, and I just help from casting, location scouting to departmental arguments. You know, I try to work more as a diplomat when it comes to my producing. Producer's kind of a vague term because there's so many types of producers. You have executive producer, which could be a lot of different things, because you can have a James Cameron type of executive producer who creates the story and also directs and, you know, does everything, or you can have an executive producer who's just a money person. And then you can have a co-executive producer, which is usually somebody that finds the money. And then you can have a line producer who's doing the day-to-day stuff. Then, you know, you have co-producer, associate producer, assistant producer, you know, production managers, all kinds of stuff. And just, I don't know, it's definitely one of those things that when you get something from paper, it's like opening a business, like a brick and mortar. You know, you have an idea, you put it from paper into something that people can actually all be a part of and see and you know, and enjoy, like in real life, you know, because dreams are cool, but it's really cool when you actually can like get a dream to like actually be real, you know. And so that's what I'm good at. I'm good at helping people like get their dreams, you know, I guess. That's what I try to do, is help them realize their dream.
Is there a theme that you lean more towards in the work that you do?
The stuff that I've worked on have been a lot of dramas. Things I've been working on personally have been more documentary kind of based. I'm finishing up a project right now called Afternoon with Lannister, and it's about a Kansas City artist who was just by chance a neighbor of mine who worked under Thomas Hart Benton, and Thomas Hart Benton's wife is also a manager for Jackson Pollock, you know, and some other great artists and stuff. So he always had these great stories. Just a really interesting character. And one afternoon, I was just like, well, I got a new camera. I'm gonna play it, you know, test this out. And I hung out with him for a few hours. And rest in peace, he passed away about a year and a half ago. But it was nice that I had that footage, you know, and I almost forgot about it. And a friend reminded me, so I've been kind of cutting that together. And then I've had a few friends who've passed, and I've done stuff like for their families to help remember and buy and stuff. Try to say stuff less. I just realized I said it twice, but right now I'm writing on two projects that are both Latino story centered, Mexican American immigration centered.
Cool. My condolences, but I'm glad to hear that you were able to capture his essence.
Yeah, for sure. It captures essence.
Yes. And now that you know, talking more about the individuals that you're working on their stories, how do you tie all of this into history as well?
Well, everything eventually becomes history, you know. I mean, it's, you know, if you break up the words, his story, you know, it's like you're just telling a story. And like the project that I'm writing now is called Cielo Colorado. I've been working on it for a long time. We've been going through a lot of rewrites, but it's mostly the story of a lot of people put into a story of one family, you know. So it's back to be another drama. It'll be a tragic story, but it'll be I think it'll be a good one to share it with people who don't understand like immigration plight. You know, like why would you want to leave your house? You know, why would you want to leave your home? You know, to a place that you've never been. You know, that's always the story. Immigrants, for the most part, never plan on leaving. You know, it's not really in the cards. You know, and I don't think a lot of people get that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I strongly agree on that. You know, it's a lot of different events that have all of these different sequences that it makes them end up here, and then we start the story all over again in a way, or a new chapter, right?
Yeah. And then that's a lot of the stuff you don't want to lose. You know, I mean, you don't want to lose. I mean, I think a lot of people lost the story how they got here. When you're dealing with, I mean, when you're dealing with WASP, type of immigration, it's like they've lost, why they got here originally, and going from, maybe as far away as the colonies of fur trading, to the south, to Missouri and Kansas, even further west than that wasn't colonized until much later. And they've already lost that story. They've already lost how'd you end up how'd they end up in Missouri? We're talking about how Latinos and Mexicans ended up here, but like, how did you guys end up here? It's like, they don't know that story.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, with that, we actually have somebody here who kind of wanted to kick it off. What started the migration of Mexicans to the Midwest, KCK and KCMO, which kind of ties into what you were just talking about right now?
Yeah. Well, Latino migration to the Midwest was initially Kansas, because Kansas is closer to Mexico. It predates Kansas actually as a state. When Mexico went through its first revolution against Spain, I think that ended in 1821. But by 1830, they had already created a treaty with the United States about immigration, and that's when you have like the very first railroads going through Santa Fe, El Paso, and all that. But the way they got all the way up here back then was through the cattle trade, bringing the cows up, and but that was not ever really it wasn't. They weren't coming to stay. It was, you go there and come back. This is pre-Mexican American War. This is pre-California having gold. So the economies of both countries were pretty similar. Like the peso and the dollar were almost interchangeable along the Santa Fe Trail. And it really wasn't until, when the railroads started really getting connected, that KCK, KCMO, had eventually as many as like 12 lines connecting through here. And I think a lot of times, because they came from a very highland region of Mexico, like Guanajuato, Michoacan, Jalisco is where my mom's from, Zacatecas is where my dad's from, San Luis Potosí. It was always kind of the region that a lot of immigrants came from. And that just kind of continued back and forth until about, I guess, the very first, I would say, in my opinion, like the first rural community in the area was Armadale.
Yeah.
Armadale would have been like one of the very first ones. But in the same respect, around, you give it another 10, 15 years, you have, Rosedale, Argentine, the West Bottoms, the West Side, all started popping up, and they were all essentially boxcar towns. People were coming up, at the turn of the century on boxcars and living out of boxcars, which is kind of amazing to think. And that happened. That went on until, even into the 30s. People have stories of coming and living in boxcars from Mexico.
Wow.
So many questions from there.
Just write them down.
I actually did. I was like, let me grab a notebook real quick so I can take some notes. So I can hit back some points. You said that one of the first communities was Armadale. That's one of the communities, in my perspective, that is still developing out, and that we, the community centers are there, but we don't give as much supplies there. Like, why do you think that it's such? I know, first thing that I think of Wine, I think Rosedale, I think St. Peter's, I think Strawberry Hill.
Strawberry Hill has kind of for a migrant story. Strawberry Hill just has kind of a contentious history with Mexicans.
Mm-hmm.
Like during the influenza flu of 1918 and World War I, they started really limiting. They started off limiting Eastern European immigrants. And there's a lot of meat factory places, a lot of railroads and stuff. And a lot of times, America's go-to was Mexico. So when they did like the Chinese Exclusion Act, a lot of Mexicans went from KC to the West because they're getting rid of all the Chinese. And then the same thing here. Whenever World War I was going on, the Spanish flu, they put the labor towards the Mexicans. The numbers exponentially grew from like 1900 to 1925 on what percentage of workers were the laborers. And World War I, World War II, I mean, a lot of the economy was based on Mexican immigration, and especially railroads, especially, meat factories. I mean, there was salt mines around the area. There was just a lot going on over here that needed laborers, and it was either too low for your typical American to want to do, and there was a lot of anti-Catholicism. You know what I mean? So that's when you had a lot of racism against Irish, a lot of racism against Italian, Eastern European. It's people who vote against themselves from those cultures. I'm like, it wasn't that far along that you weren't white. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's literally 30, 40 years that you were like not on the same page.
Yeah.
I'm not sure to answer your question.
It's okay. I'm still learning a lot because just hearing the stories, because that's a lot of the things that we don't hear nowadays. We don't doing certain projects and doing certain things. I come back to the same question of like, what is our history? What has been the struggles that our communities have seen that has taken us to being able to have these stores, these streets now full of Hispanic-owned stores, spices that we're used to, foods that we're used to. How did we get to that space from, boxcars?
Well, the boxcar communities, it's almost when I related to the other side of the track where it comes from. Like, I would almost guarantee it came from KCMO, KCK. Because they literally were the barrios.
Yeah,
those were the places, and the reasons why they were able to keep the culture so well inside of them was because they lived and they worked and they spoke together. But it's also a reason why you have a disconnect between Mexicans, in the community, because you have Mexicans who look, if you want to be superficial, they look a certain way, and you're like, and they get offended, when you try to speak Spanish to them. It's not the person's fault, but where they're from, if they speak Spanish, and sometimes it's embarrassing for the person because they don't speak Spanish. But you're dealing with the turn of the century racism, which is like, there's a lot of racism going on now, and there's always, but that turn of the century racism against being Mexican, speaking, even Italian, or even being Irish, speaking funny. That there a lot of parents that don't want their kids to grow up, with hardship, or however you want to say. They wanted them to Americanize. There was a school that was made just to Americanize Mexicans in Armadale, in Argentina.
Which one was that?
I have to. It's in my notes. It was I'm gonna find it right now. I'll get to it when I get back into it. But yeah, I'll remember it.
That's
it was yeah. I can't remember if it was Argentina or it was Armadale. But they had those schools, and the oldest, and it's one of the two oldest Mexican American community outreach programs in the country outside the Southwest. You have the Guadalupe Center.
Yeah.
And you have the one, but it's not there anymore. But it was like a Mexican Methodist association who created it, and they would do stuff like dental work, medical work, pre-K.
Wow.
Night school.
Okay.
And it was a Mexican Methodist organization, which it was kind of just surprising that they were Mexican Methodists, but I guess especially back then. I was Mexican everything, but if you're thinking of 1910,
Yeah.
But who knows?
Well, that part's so interesting because my dad's family came from Guanajuato. And it was back in the late 60s, 60s. And yeah, you're right. They were on the west side in the projects, but most of his brothers, he had 8 brothers and sisters, moved to KCK, in the Armadale, Argentine area. And that's still where they reside now. And it was the same thing. We didn't learn Spanish. It was trying to be Americanized, take away your culture, just because of all the racism and pain that he experienced as a child into his adulthood in those areas.
Yeah, racism was, Kansas, they kind of sugarcoat a lot of what happened, especially in the 20s after World War I. The flu, like the Spanish flu, they were packing, even Mexican American, Kansas born citizens, but just because they're of Mexican descent, into basements of buildings for school, like 80-to-1 ratio to teachers. you know, just because they were scared of like the flu, you know, they're like, they're brown, they have it, you know, and and I mean the Klan, you know, in the 20s had an office on, you know, downtown on Minnesota in KCK.
What? Okay, that's new to me. That is interesting.
Yeah,
so
I mean,
literally in downtown KCK.
Yeah, they had a Klan office.
You said on Minnesota?
Yeah.
On Minnesota, yeah.
Do you know what? Is the building still up? Or
I have to go through my notes. These all I'm kind of going off of the top of my head on most of this stuff. I got a few notes, but yeah.
I know. There
was a, you know, around the turn of the century, it's kind of an interesting story because he had this hub of all these railroads. And Kansas City still is a pretty big hub for freight, you know. But there was a railroad called the Kansas City Mexico Orient Railroad, KCMO. It was pretty short lived, but it ended up only lasting, I think, like 4 years. But the person who owned it was one of the Kempers, you know.
Oh, really?
Yeah, from like U.S. Bank or Commerce Bank nowadays, and they ended up finding oil under the railroad tracks.
Wow.
Which really helped. Which really helped the family.
Exactly.
But you know, but a lot of times, you know, when you're dealing with the road, like the Rosedale, Argentine, Armadale, West Bottoms, West Side, they're all tied by rail. I mean, they're all like right there, you know. And those neighborhoods ended up becoming like more. I mean, eventually, you know, we get into the 60s and 50s, they got shut off from the community, you know. I mean, and that was another way they kind of kept their own culture. But that's like, you know, like you said, your dad not wanting to share the language. That's what created other cultures. That's why you kind of get like this like Cholo culture or Chicano culture, you know. Or that's because you're being separated en masse, you know, by redlining, you know, so to speak. You know, it's like you're not allowed past the highway. You're not allowed past, you know, the rail yard, you know. And I mean, I grew up, you know, in the 90s, and there was a lot of violence between those neighborhoods, you know, like. I mean, there's violence still now, but back then it was crazy because everyone was, I think, going through this. They don't know who, you know, I don't know who I am, you know, like kind of mentality.
We have a question from Celia. She wants to say, thank you for sharing your local research, Sergio. Earlier you mentioned a divide between Latino communities. There is still a strong divide in KC between recent immigrants and more established immigrants. Any thoughts on how we can help connect these communities? That's a great question, Celia.
It is, yeah. No, it is. But I think it's always been an issue. Like Mexico is even divided in Mexico. You know what I mean?
Yeah. My husband tells me that all the time. I never visited, and my husband's from Mexico City, and he's like, "We don't go to the ranches."
Like Chilangos think they're up here, you know. Yes. Like Jalisco's think they're up here, you know. Yes. Like Michoacan think they're up here, you know. Yes. Like it's because it's like Mexico doesn't have like the wide and long space of America. We don't have straight lines. You know, I mean, it's just, you know, you can travel across America, no problem. You know, 12 hours, you get through, you know, 6 states, you know, whatever. Mexico, the lines go in between each other. So like for me to get from Puerto Vallarta to like Guadalajara, where my family's at, I have to drive through Zacatecas twice, you know. So those lines are very hard fought.
Yeah.
You know, and it's the same thing with lines in Kansas City, and I think it's getting better. I think like social media, and I think that the access to information and being able to travel to different places, different restaurants, makes it a little better. But there's always going to be a fear. But I think that's what you have to grapple with, is what you're like. If you don't like somebody, it's usually for a fear of something, or it's a reflection on yourself somehow. You know what I mean? So not to make it, you know, completely, you know, mental, but it's a lot of that, you know. It's a lot that I think we just need to, I mean, everyone just needs to, you know, show up more often for each other's stuff. You know, I mean, if Argentines having a party, I'm seeing them, go there, you know. I mean, if the West Side's having a party on 16th. I mean, you can do 5 parties in a weekend. I mean, we party like Mexicans. We party like we have 3 or 4 days every time. You know, I mean, we need to like all like share. You know.
Yeah, true. But I do understand where she comes from, because somebody who doesn't know Spanish, right? And I've kind of always been put in that category because I'm Mexican American. I am Chicana, and even that word in Kansas City, Probably even when I first started my first festival back about 4 years ago, it was a derogatory term. Like when I would say it, they'd be like, why would you ever put that on a festival? You know, we had a lot of people just say, don't ever talk about that. That's very stereotypical. And
I call myself Chicano, you know. I mean, when people do my interviews or my film stuff, you know, I'm a Chicano filmmaker, you know. And it's not to make it a divide against anything. It's just that it's you know, we're all, it's even hard. I mean, you even have arguments over, you know, is Hispanic okay to use? Is Latino okay to use? You know, I mean, because Hispanic is Iberian Peninsula, you know, I mean, and Latino, you know, it has ties to Latin America, but it's originally tied to, you know, the southern area of Italy, you know what I mean? And Mexico has a lot of immigration. Like Mexico has immigrants, you know, really from Germany, Eastern Europe, you know, Spain, Italy. We have everybody. I mean, that's why Mexico was so connected with Germany. You know, that's why our flag is Italian, is because of Maximilian, you know, our last emperor. You know, it's like, I'm not sure if anybody wonders why, like, we have the same color flag as Italy, you know, it's because of the Habsburgs when they were the emperors, you know, in the 1860s, and Napoleon III, you know. Wow. It's just that there's well, I don't know. At the end of the day, like, we're all in, like that's what America's kind of missing, I think. Is like, if I spend time filming in Colombia and Ecuador and even in Mexico, is at the end of the day, everyone's Colombian, everyone's Mexican, everyone's, you know, in the country. You know, I mean, like, we can all root for the same soccer team. But I think in America, it's harder to like be in the same circle. You know, I mean, it doesn't really matter what ethnicity you are. You know, I mean, it's like it feels like to be American, it has to be a really high, like, you know, and a lot of people just feel like fringe, and I don't know. And there's always just fears of immigration. There's always immigrant fears. That's been pushed since the Romans, you know, or even before.
Yeah.
I have a question. How do you think that our history can teach us what actually is a two-parted? How do you think our history can teach us how to deal with issues that we face today, and how can we learn from our history so we know maybe where to pick up or where to start off at, or maybe just learn from, you know, lessons learned? Is there anything that we can
I think
into?
I mean, a lot of it is divide and conquer. So it's a lot of easy political, there's a lot of games that get played, you know what I mean? And even there was probably 3 or 4 influxes of Latinos into the area. I focus on Mexico because Mexico was the first one and it's the most prominent, you know what I mean? But in the last 30 years, we've had people from Central America, you know, a lot coming in. But when we had those influxes, like a lot of times they was always used to be the burden of labor, you know, like, you know, America went to World War I, so they don't want to, you know, they needed the labor force, so they would ease restrictions and let the workers come here. And then they would make it harder for them to become immigrants by having that literacy test, you know, or having this or that. And when they didn't need them, you know, then you created marijuana laws, you know what I mean? Then you create this, you know, this fear of anything, you know, and they push them back. And I think it was a lot easier. I'm an open border type of guy. Not to say we open all the borders to everything, but back a lot of times when they needed the help, if Mexicans have a home to go back to, they're not going to stay here, you know, or anybody, you know. Mm-hmm. And they made it was a lot easier to be transient. Like, you could come work, do your job, and go home. You know, like a lot of the people who were coming originally on the boxcars were single men, which is not that different from now. You know, who come, send their money back, but they limited their stay from May to October. That was the only months that they could work. And then they'd go back. And I think that, you know, the more you do when you do the restrictions wrong, you're trapping people in the wrong country. You know what I mean? Because then they can't go back. You know, like, you're trapping people with like, you know, there's not an option to return to the family, you know, and then they're forced to bring their family here, you know, almost. And so I think that's a lesson to be learned on there's a balance, you know, I mean, to have safe borders and keep, you know, violence out and keep, you know, people safe, but also to make sure that there's not food shortages, you know what I mean? And that there's not, you know, people in cages, you know, it's ridiculous.
It is.
So we have another question from Celia, which is a great one because she is asking about anything you can share on Mexican immigration to the Northeast KCMO. And the only history I know about that is Italians, because my dad went to high school in Northeast and really was all Italian Americans in that district when he went back in the 70s.
Well, the Northeast is one of the older neighborhoods, especially for like a nice neighborhood. It's one of the oldest kind of, you know, Scarrett, Reverend Scarrett came with the guy who Johnson County is named after and founded it. You know, that's where he lived, beautiful Scarrett Manor. And so, but it's always been a migrant neighborhood. So even before the Italians, it was Irish, you know, so it was an Irish neighborhood. And then the Irish, you know, ended up, not that they got pushed out, you know, but they moved on to other neighborhoods or, you know, get married, you know, their kids married, you know, somebody that wasn't Irish, you know, and they went off to the suburbs, you know. Same thing happened with the Italians. The Italians forever was an Italian neighborhood, you know, from, you know, it was a really good mix between Irish and Italian. And then the Irish left first, and then the Italians left. And after the flood of 51, which washed out all the low-lying areas, like, you know, Argentine, Armadale, the West Bottoms, you know, a lot of these families got displaced and they just moved to higher ground. And so a lot of them went, you know, to the west side. A lot of them went Rosedale, and then a lot of them just went to the Northeast. And but that's it's funny because with the Northeast, it's a more of a dynamic migrant neighborhood than any other part of the city, because you have not just Mexican. I mean, you have Asian, you have you know, Ivory Coast African, you know, you have Somali, you know, you have it's just a migrant neighborhood, and it's I think it's always been because it's a corridor, you know, you can get there. So I see stuff they're asking them. Yeah, so it's always been a migrant neighborhood, but it seems like the migrants always come in groups. And when immigration happens, they usually move people of a similar area to a similar area. You know, if you look at Muslim in Dearborn, Michigan, which is always like a political argument, you know. But even now, if you look at like Olathe and DeSoto, you know, a lot of those people are from Zacatecas.
Mm-hmm.
You know.
So do you have any information on any of the families that have been long-standing here, that have rooted themselves probably from very early on and continue to be here in Kansas or in Missouri?
Yeah, every neighborhood has there's definitely a lot of families.
I feel like there's just like these, when you hear a name, like there's so many, like, you know, just like we had on yesterday, Pacina, like the Pacina family's been here for a very long time. You know, they have a history of generations of people, and just learning about how they came here and settled, and then their family settled, and all the amazing work. A lot of the
story comes from these railroads. If you're doing anything up until the 30s, you know, in the 30s, you get kind of a pause. I mean, in the 20s, they started kind of just deporting us, like Mexicans from KC. Like they started just sending them back after like the anti-Semitism, well, not Semitism, but the anti-sentiment of Eastern Europe kind of went, and they needed more for the white workers. I mean, I'm trying to look at the numbers here, but there was like a day that they called it Coach Day, where like a Mexican American organizations as well as the Kansas City Chamber in 1921 sent like 1,000 families back. It was like, oh, free trip back to Mexico. And you know, by the end of it, it was 70,000 families had been expelled that were living here. And that caused like a vacuum, because you had people who had been in Kansas City for, you know, 20 years or longer, you know, who had kids and families. Then they ended up leaving kids that are, you know, 12, 13, 14 years old to fend for themselves. These are young men, but, you know. Mm-hmm. They called it Coach Day. It was June of 1921. They just gave everyone a free pass back to Mexico.
Coach Day.
So outside of like the truck rails, you had to meet plants, which affected the Slavics. But in 1910, the track labor was 55% Mexican. It was 85% Mexican by 1920, and 90% by 1925. So that's what you kind of see, like a reason to kind of get rid of them. I mean, from one side, obviously.
Yeah. So Lori said, when are you going to write your book? You have so much history.
This is my book on tape right now. I'll listen to it again.
I have a question on another topic. How have you seen the development of Latinos, Hispanics being integrated into the voting system? Like, one of the things that I've always wondered is like, what is our history in voting? What have we done? Have we?
There's been a lot of attempts. So like it's just different. Like you had the Irish clubs of Democratic parties, the turn of the century to the 20s. That ended up causing violence between the Pendergasts and the other guy, Fitzpatrick, I think was his name. But because they had their own clubs, their Democratic clubs. Same thing with the Irish American Democratic clubs. They ended up kind of being front for violence. But they got the votes out. You know what I mean? But there's the most violent people in the Latino community aren't really too politically pushy right now. So the community that organize itself. I'm just comparing it to history. You know what I mean? Not saying that that someone should go stuff ballots or anything like they used to, but I think it's just when you feel like you're on the fringe and you feel disenfranchised and you hear like so much hate getting spewed just regularly, like you feel defeated, you know what I mean? And people who are raising families and are working and, have people who are legal in their families, it's like, that's why the same reason why we probably have like the least amount of people who turn to the police when they need help, probably have the least amount of money invested into a bank account. It's like, we're only this much in a part of the system, you know what I mean? And the rest of it, it's like, we'll figure it out ourselves, which is another reason why we have so much violence, It's because we're not, the people who don't vote just are the same people mentally think that it's more of an arm's reach argument, you know what I mean? That you fix it within an arm's reach and everything outside of that, at least in my opinion.
Yeah.
And so I think you definitely have to get people to the polls. I mean, it's just America's bad at polls. I mean, we only had a 45% voter turnout in the last election.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, and I guess like I'm going in even further. I guess like what has been our role in politics as a community. I know that it has been not as developed out, but I guess I was just wondering, was it something like, when there was the first person that I believe that the Argentine middle school was named after was named after one of the first Hispanics that graduated high school. So,
well, it was his father. It was named after his father. His father actually was it was in 1930, but his father started the argument in the 20s. Because there was no obligation to give Mexican Americans educations.
Wow.
It was Kansas State, and so it got really complicated. Like the Mexican embassy, the consulate in Kansas City, actually, the consulate used its diplomats with the U.S. State Department to push the state of Kansas for a basic education, like under the 14th Amendment, and then the Treaty of Largo, which ended the Mexican American War, which provided guarantee for civic and civil rights to Mexican American citizens. And they weren't doing it. They weren't going to do it, and they took it all the way to the State Department to do it. So the gentleman who you did it was until, let me see if I can find it, what his name was. Don't have his name, but yeah, it was a big deal. It was a big deal because it really took the Mexican government to go to the U.S. State Department to get them like access to anything above an 8th grade education, and that was all the way until 1930.
So the Mexican government, would that be something like the Mexican consulate nowadays?
Yeah. So the consulate used the embassy powers to go to the State Department, the U.S. State Department, to go to the state of Kansas to provide basic education rights to Mexican Americans that were born in Kansas.
That That is really cool. I had no idea that that's what happened. I knew that it was very important, but I didn't know the background story.
That's 4 years. Yeah, it took him 4 years. I remember that. Yeah, well, it's 18 months. But yeah, his son's graduated, but they named it after the father. But it was kind of crazy because they segregated the schools and they would kind of create like Mexican schools, you know. So there was Mexican segregated schools, and then when the flood happened, they were like, okay, fine. You know, some schools were like, okay, we'll take the Mexican, you know, kids or whatever. But I mean, it wouldn't be. But a lot of schools, I mean, in the state of Kansas, I mean, they fought segregation until 1954.
Wow.
You know.
Wow.
Like, it's crazy. It's not that long ago, you know.
Oh man.
So with your so you're saying you're putting together a film with all of this, right? Is that what you're working on, a documentary?
Yeah, or a book, I guess. I don't know. Maybe I'll be a writer.
Luis says, "Hola, Sergio."
Hi, hermano. But I mean, the segregation is really long-standing. Like, I mean, the communities. I mean, the West Side always had not always, but had the Guadalupe Center. You know what I mean? And the people involved with that were very, 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 very. Dorothy, what was her name? Dorothy Geller or something like that. But the priest and the woman who opened it, you know, had a really big compassion. I think KCK has really had to fight more for itself. You know, when it came to these, because Kansas is, you know, definitely more conservative, you know, and with Kansas City has always been a little more progressive because it's been a little more loose. You know, if you look at like prohibition and you look at, you know, all these things that wouldn't matter so much, and you know, from the difference of a state line, you know, like when they needed. Like they loosened like immigration requirements for World War II because they needed bodies, essentially. You know what I mean? And when these men came back to Kansas, and they finally got the GI Bill, they got these other things that could help them. I mean, they weren't even allowed their own legion. They weren't allowed to go to the American Legion. They had to create their own. That's how you have the Eagle's Nest. You know, the Eagle's Nest down there. That's how it started. It was created just because of Mexicans returning from war.
Wow, I did not know that at all. That's a whole thing right there.
That's a whole thing.
Sally,
I mean, those guys are badass. You know what I mean? Like Topeka had the Diamond Club, you know, in the 20s that created, you know, had like football and soccer teams and, you know, halls. And I mean, our grandparents, you know, like collectively are just badass. Talk about the greatest generation, you know, talk about the greatest of the greatest generation, really. You know what I mean? For the shit they had to go through.
Yes.
See, that
my dad had a band called the Chicanos. And when I look at that now, I'm like, wow, that's crazy, you know, that they used
way ahead of his time
back then, you know, and
way ahead of his time.
That's who they were, you know. So
but that's you can't crush the spirit though, you know. I mean, that's all like, you know, like the Zoot Suiters, you know, in LA. Yeah. You know, like to take on like the Navy.
Yeah.
You know, for like 3 days. it's like I mean, it's a strong culture that I think, you know, there's a Chicano Cholo culture in Japan.
Yeah.
You know, that's in the low riders, that's into like, you know, little homie drawing type stuff, and you know, it's just like, and I think that like, I don't know, I think that we all need to be proud of like where we come from, and also be super grateful of where we are. You know, and you know, and not. But there's a difference between, you know, getting punched in the face and taking it, you know, and then having boundaries, you know, like, and having boundaries and like what's allowed, you know, because we're all human.
Well, and that's the whole thing. And I just love that we're talking about the Chicana culture more openly now. I know when I was growing up, it was just something you didn't talk about. You know, your family knew, you knew, but it was just like nothing you exposed outside of, you know, your family realm, I felt like. So just talking about it now openly and like, you know, how great we are and what we've done and the roots within that, you know. Do
you know where the Chicana roots come from? Like, at least in my opinion, for the 80s and 90s was, so you ever wonder why there's so many Raiders fans in Kansas City? Like, why are there so many Raiders fans? It's not just a Chicano thing. It really isn't. like it's kind of, I'm a little annoyed by it, but there's a lot of Raiders fans. But the reason that is because
we're gonna have some Raider haters, like Raiders up here, like.
No, it's fine. I mean, the Las Vegas Raiders have never won a Super Bowl, so I can't prove me wrong on that. Not going to try to get too much hate mail on this. No,
yes, I know. This broadcast will end today.
So what happened was that the last real big influx of Mexicans that came in a wave was in the early 80s. When you had like all these new Mexicans that came to Kansas City. And that was because GM had a plant called the Fremont plant in the Bay Area.
Yeah.
And then they shut down and they moved all the families here. So like thousands of workers, thousands of family members, all from the Bay, moved to Kansas City in the early 80s.
Wow.
That's how I ended up here, being from San Jose and moving when I was 2. So you end up with Oakland Raiders fans in the thousands. Raider Nation's a huge nation. They have one of the strongest fan bases. But that's how they brought with that a lot of that Cholo culture, a lot of that Chicano culture that the hairs, the Dickies, all that stuff. When you start seeing it, when that huge influx came, and I think it was kind of funny that no one really kind of put the two together because I grew up with it. Seeing it happen.
And I think you just lose history when you don't talk about it, and then it just kind of dies. But it's funny. You said you're from San Jose?
Yeah.
I had 2 friends now. They Lucero and Jennifer, and they're from San Jose, and they are die-hard San Jose people. Like that is their home. Like it's so funny.
Well, San Jose. Well, it's affected a lot of Kansas City culture. Like Tech Nine was big in Northern California before he was big here. He was big in the Southwest before he was big here. I had a label that I was messing with in the late 90s, like 97, 98, out of Wyandotte. We're based out of 23rd and Quindaro. And you'd have a lot of good artists come through. And I think really what happened was when Nelly came through, because before it used to be a little more collaboration between KC and St. Louis, but it was like pre-Google, and St. Louis won the World Series and won the Super Bowl, and then he dropped that album in 2000, it blew up, and St. Louis isn't called Illinois City, like Kansas City MO is Kansas City, Missouri, and so it really set back music, for a lot of artists a lot back here, and Tech had Travis, who was his partner, who allowed him to put him on the road, do merchandise, and a lot of people in Northern California had family in KC, and so they had a lot of connections, and then you have the sad stories of why Mac Dre was here when he got killed, coming from the Bay, from San Jose, it's a deep story when you get into that, which could be a whole other documentary.
And we're going to have you back on to talk about all the cultural pieces of it, because there was another comment on here that talked about we hit the music and how much that's influenced a lot of what is happening. And people are just bringing in comments about the Eagle's Nest. You're bringing up stuff that we don't talk about a lot that we need to talk about. Yeah. And then Jose was the hip hop culture tells a story in its music. Absolutely. So before
there was a club. I remember '99. There was a club called the Up Club at Ralph Quindaro. It was an old house, and it was cool. The grandma would cook upstairs, and the basement was the venue. The Up Club, not the Up Club, is what it's called. The Up Club, and I can't remember who it was. It was either 369 Mafia or 504 Boys. Whoever was playing there one night, they had a bus. It was a crazy dude. It's a whole other story. I was 17 when I was I was in places I should not have been back then.
We were probably at the same club, didn't even know.
Yeah, probably.
Do you have any Latino Mexican history books that people could reference?
Not a fan. A lot of stuff that there's a lot of this about that I'm into. There's a lot of independent study, a lot of stuff that I'm just curious about. If I think of anything, I'll definitely I'll comment on this video. And
okay. Yeah, because it looks like we're getting a lot of comments on here. Rupert saying, I've been to Japan many times, probably 12 times in the last 4 years. I absolutely love Japanese culture. They have always been so welcoming and hospitable. My best experience was when I was to a festival where they had everyone dressed as samurais and with all the full Japanese armor and katana swords. I found the biggest samurai there, and oh my God, okay. Didn't read all that.
I read all that. It's...
Okay, you're a faster reader than me, but we'll just get back all the others.
But good for you, though. I mean, he seemed like he enjoyed it.
Exactly, and he knows about Japan culture. Before we let you go, Sergio, I'd love to have you back again, just to talk more about. There's so much depth within our roots. Like we just got to the surface, not even the surface. I felt like, because you brought up a lot of stuff that we know about but don't know about here in Kansas City.
Yeah, and thank you.
I'm happy to share it. I'm glad you asked me to come on.
Yeah.
I'm better behind the camera than I am in front of it. So thanks for bearing with me.
Well, thank you for sharing anyways. I think a lot of it, me just listening into your guys' conversation, I'm learning a lot, because it's just exactly what Deanna said. We know about it, but we don't really know about it. So it's cool to hear the whole history, and it also triggering a lot of different questions. And I think, like Deanna said, this is the start of something that we really definitely need to learn. There's so many roots here that we're bypassing like crazy. It feels like. So
I mean, I would bypass it. Not bypass it, but I would challenge anybody watching. Everyone has a smartphone. Everyone has a camera on it. Find the oldest person in your family. Talk to them, ask them. I mean, like, what's your first memory of KC? What was it like? What's going on? I mean, I'll cut that. I'm easier to cut stuff in than to shoot it. I can't be everywhere at once, but yeah, I mean, that'd be a challenge for everyone. Find those elders, that probably don't want that never want to tell the story, And at this point, it's like there's nothing to be ashamed about anymore. There's nothing to hide no more. Get those clips, get those stories, because you never know when you can get them again.
Yeah, absolutely. Agree 100%. That's going to be our challenge now, is to make sure everybody kind of gets that little bits and pieces for sure.
Yeah.
Well, Sergio, we're going to have you back for sure. So I'll reach out and see when you can come back to give us some more, depth into this cultural roots, because we need it. And I'm just glad that you offered to do this openly and share your story with us. And we'll be looking out for any work that you're going to be doing. Let us know so we can share it.
Sure. I'm here when you need me.
All right. Thanks, Sergio. Thank you, Diosselyn. Thanks for being on here with me.
All right. Thank you.
Nice meeting you both. Bye-bye.